Do you feel safer now? Or do old wounds still echo sometimes?
When my parents told me they couldn't afford my wedding, I took them at their word because that is what you do when you still want to believe your family means well even when the words don't feel right in your chest. And I swallowed the sting with a smile that felt like chewing glass and said it was fine, that we would keep things small and simple, that I didn't need anything big or flashy, because I thought being reasonable would be seen as respectful rather than convenient for them. And I told myself that grown adults pay their own way anyway, that it was normal, that I wasn't a teenager with a prom dress dream. I was a woman making a life, and if my parents were tight on money, then I would not add pressure, I would just adjust. So I did what practical people do when their feelings are bruised, but they still have a life to build, which is to take a deep breath, plan what they can, and cut out the parts that would make the budget spiral. And we chose the courthouse because it was quick and clean and honestly less stressful than managing vendors who treat you like you're one awkward email from losing your deposit. And we had a dinner after with a couple of friends and my husband's parents. And I told myself that this wasn't a loss, that it was a choice, that I was choosing peace over spectacle, and I even said to my mom on the phone that I understood, that things happen, that the economy is a mess, that they didn't owe me anything, and she said something like, "You're such an adult about it," which landed like a compliment and an apology stapled together with cheap tape. Then, around half a year later, an envelope showed up, cream and heavy in a way that made its weight feel smug, with my sister's name in a script she would never have chosen on her own because she hates anything that looks old-fashioned. And inside was the save-the-date for the wedding she had dreamed about since middle school, complete with a venue that charges a rental fee that could make a used car blush, and a list of events that read like a travel itinerary for people who never check their bank balance. And before I even asked, my aunt mentioned on a call that mom and dad were so excited to give her the wedding she deserves, and she said it the way people talk about long overdue raises or finally fixing a roof, like a moral debt being paid. And I stood in my kitchen with that card in my hand thinking about the word deserve and where it had been hiding when I was planning my tiny day. If you're waiting for the scene where I confront my parents with shaking hands and a cracked voice, it didn't happen, because the thing about finally seeing a pattern is that you don't argue with a pattern, you just recognize it and stop pretending it is anything else. And my pattern has always been that I got the practical speech while my sister got the confetti, that I got the "you're strong, you'll figure it out" line while she got the "we'll handle it" promise, and once I let that truth sit in the room without decorating it or trimming it or making excuses for it, I felt this switch flip that I didn't know I had, and it wasn't rage, not the loud kind anyway, it was quiet like a door closing in a hallway you didn't know was still open. I went to one of the pre-wedding things, a bridal shower where the gifts were not so much gifts as they were proof of status, and my mother moved around the room like she was hosting a charity gala for a cause called Our Family is Impressive. And every time I caught her eye, she gave me that warm smile that means don't ruin this, and I realized I didn't have anything to ruin because nothing in that room belonged to me. Not the stories, not the attention, not the role of the daughter who gets fussed over, and I stood there holding a ribbon wand someone handed me as if I were an usher at an event where my presence was necessary, but my personhood was optional. My husband asked later, in the car, if I was okay, and I told him that I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, and I said I didn't want to fight because fights imply that there's a prize you can win if you say the right words. And I already knew what the prize was and who had it and why the rules were elastic for her and concrete for me. And he squeezed my hand and said we could skip whatever we wanted to skip, and that sentence sat in my mind like a key on a table waiting for me to pick it up. I will admit something that doesn't make me look noble, which is that I waited for one meaningful acknowledgement from my parents, not an apology crafted like a press release. Just a real sentence that showed they remembered how they had told me they couldn't afford it and how that had landed. But what I got instead were updates on the cake and the band and a text from my mom about how she found a dress she felt good in. And in that moment I understood that they had rewritten my wedding in there memory as a mature choice rather than a corner I was pushed into, and that revision made it easier for them to talk about my sister's big day without tripping over me. The hook here is simple and it is sharp. When my parents said they couldn't afford my wedding, I shrank my day to fit their limits. When they paid for my sister's dream wedding, I stopped shrinking, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And I decided I would never again hand them the scissors. I did not throw a scene. I did not deliver a speech. I did not give them the show people expect in family dramas where someone flips a table and storms out, because I have learned that the loud moment gives everyone something to point at while they ignore the quiet facts. And the quiet fact was this: my parents made a choice, and I get to make choices too. So I started thinking not about how to hurt them or teach them a lesson, because they don't learn lessons that cost them comfort, but about how to take back my life in a way that did not require their permission or their participation. And if that sounds cold, maybe it is, but cold can be clean, and clean is what I needed. By the time the official invitation arrived, with its little map and its hotel block and its list of festivities that could pass for a travel brochure, I had decided on something that would take more discipline than rage ever could. Something that didn't involve ruining a party or sabotaging a vendor. Something that wouldn't give anyone a neat story where I was the jealous sister acting out. I decided they would never see me beg again, and I decided they would never see what I was about to do, which was not to break anything of theirs, but to quietly build something of mine that they could not enter, not with guilt, not with pressure. Not with the old lines about family sticking together, because once you understand you were never really being held, it becomes shockingly easy to let go. The thing that kept me up the week after the bridal shower was not the money itself, because I have been covering my own life for years, and I can do the math without flinching. It was the sentence underneath the money. The one that has been echoing since we were kids, but always dressed up to sound reasonable. The sentence that goes, "She needs it and you will be fine." And I realized that almost every milestone in our family has been negotiated on those terms, where my sister's needs were framed as emergencies or investments and my needs were framed as opportunities for character development. And because I wanted to be the kind of daughter who did not add weight to the family, I volunteered again and again to carry the heavier bag, then thanked them for trusting me with it like I had been given a prize. When I finally sat down with a notebook, not to make lists for the wedding I did not have, but to inventory the moments I had been told to accept less without complaint, the pages filled faster than I was ready for. And it started to feel less like journaling and more like reading a ledger that someone else had kept without my permission, because there it was in black ink: the dance classes my sister got because she had talent, the community college I attended because I was practical, the car she received when a bad boyfriend drained her savings, the lectures I received about being responsible and learning to budget, the way she was encouraged to try again after every misstep with family support while I was encouraged to be proud of my resilience. As if resilience were a reward rather than a sign that someone has been tested a little too often. I started telling small truths out loud, not to my parents yet, but to the safe people who had watched all this for years and stayed quiet because they did not want to start a fight at Thanksgiving. And my husband said that it had always been obvious to him that I had been placed in the adult chair before I had a driver's license, while my friend Lydia said something that slid into me like a lock clicking, which was that my parents used the story of me being strong to excuse not showing up, and I felt this weird mix of anger and relief, because hearing it spoken without varnish made it undeniable and somehow easier to act on. And for the first time, I stopped asking whether I was being too sensitive and started asking what the cost would be of staying numb. I knew better than to come at my parents with accusations that would invite a debate about dates and bank statements and who remembers which conversation correctly, because they always win on technicalities and I always lose on impact. So I chose a smaller but cleaner battlefield, which was the bridal party role my mother had been circling me about for weeks, and on a Tuesday morning before work I called my sister and told her that I loved her and would attend as a guest, that I would not be a bridesmaid, that I was not the right person to fix last-minute emergencies and absorb stress while smiling on command, and I expected her to explode or guilt trip or at least perform a sad sigh. But instead, she said she wanted the weekend to be easy and that she would put our cousin in the spot, and I heard in her voice the relief of a person who has always assumed I would carry extra and was secretly afraid I might finally stop. And I hung up with my heart hammering because the first boundary is always the loudest in your own chest even when your voice stays calm. My mother texted before lunch with the performance of concern she has perfected, the one that begins with "Are you sure?" and ends with "Your sister will be so hurt." And I typed slowly because I did not want to hand her phrases she could use later to reframe me as cruel. And I said that I wanted to be present and kind that day, and that I could not do that if I was running logistics. And she wrote back a long paragraph about family pride and appearances, and how people might talk, and I felt that old reflex rise, the one where I rushed to comfort her about a situation she created, but I did something different this time. I let the silence sit, and after an hour she sent a second message with a period that sounded like a slammed door, saying she would let the wedding planner know. That afternoon I took a second step that felt small from the outside and enormous on the inside, and I called our bank to remove my parents as emergency contacts. Then I updated the HR portal at work so that the person to be notified was my husband only, because if the people who told me I was strong could not be trusted to handle my joy, they would not have access to my crises either, and I know that sounds harsh. But there is a point where you realize that access is not the same as love, and that proximity is not the same as support, and I was done letting old habits masquerade as safety plans. At dinner that night, my husband asked what the plan was beyond surviving the wedding weekend without being trapped in service roles, and I told him something that sounded cold even to me, which was that I wanted to train my parents on a new reality. Not by lectures or fights or essays, but by consistent behavior that made it clear there were now doors they could not open and levers they could not pull. And he nodded the way someone nods when they see you have shifted from hoping for a better past to building a different future, and we clinked glasses in a quiet kitchen, and I felt steadier than I had in months. Of course, the family grapevine kicked into gear, because news like this always finds oxygen, and an aunt called to ask if I was really stepping back, using the tone people reserve for gossip that doubles as concern, and I said yes without justification. And she started telling me about all the ways my parents had sacrificed and how hard they had worked, which I did not deny, because success and favoritism are not enemies, they are cousins who often live in the same house, and I ended the call by saying I would be at the wedding as a guest, as a sister, and that I wanted a good day, not a perfect picture, and after I put the phone down I realized I had just practiced for the bigger conversations that would surely come. The small revenge, if you even want to call it that, landed the next morning when my mother sent a group email to the bridal party announcing the change, and I watched my phone stay quiet because no one knew what to say to the daughter who had stopped volunteering to bleed. And in that quiet I felt a rush of pure relief, because I had finally done something measurable that reclaimed a piece of my time and my sanity, and the most interesting part was that the world did not collapse, no. Catastrophe arrived, only a rearrangement that showed me how much of the load I had been carrying had been made of other people's expectations rather than actual necessity. By the end of that week I understood two things with a clarity that felt almost medicinal. First, that the pattern was not going to change because I asked nicely, and second, that if I wanted a different ending I had to write it without their permission. Which is why I opened a new document on my laptop and started listing every door in my life they still had keys to, actual and metaphorical, and I promised myself that by the time my parents got back from celebrating my sister like a sponsored event, those keys would be useless, not because I was burning the house down, but because I was changing the locks. And if you think that sounds dramatic, wait until you hear what I decided to do next, because the next move would make it very clear that the daughter they had trained to accept less had finally learned a new trick, one that would not scream or beg or plead, but would make sure they could never again rearrange my life without my consent. Once I said out loud that I would stop carrying what was never mine, the next steps came faster than I expected, not because I suddenly became fearless, but because the logic finally outgrew the guilt. And when logic gets bigger than guilt, it becomes surprisingly easy to do what should have been done years ago. So I sat with a notebook and went line by line through the places my family still had quiet access to my life, and I changed the locks, not with speeches or scenes, but with forms and signatures and a steady refusal to provide the usual explanations that invite debate rather than respect, and the first lock I changed was the one I should have changed the day I got married. which was the emergency contact fields everywhere from my doctor to my job to the mortgage company, because it turns out that when people have never shown up for your joy, they do not get first dibs on your crises either. So I made my husband the only primary, and I left the secondary blank because a blank was safer than a hand that has always reached for the wrong lever. I moved on to the bank, where a well-meaning teller once talked me into adding my mother as a backup in case of emergencies after a scare with my appendix. A decision I forgot about because life gets busy and because I wanted to believe that adding her gave me safety rather than vulnerability. And I sat across from a new manager who did not know my family and did not care about our history, and I said I needed to review every authorization. And when he read off the access list, I felt a jolt, not of fear, but of recognition, because there it was in a neat row of checkboxes, the casual permissions that let people who do not respect my boundaries walk through the side door. So I removed them, signed the paper, and walked out with a folder that felt less like paperwork and more like a quiet announcement that my adulthood no longer required a permission slip. I know how this sounds to people who will say that money and paperwork are cold instruments for warm problems, but here is the truth I wish I had learned sooner, that people who benefit from your compliance will always call your boundaries cold. And the only way to make that accusation lose its power is to stop chasing their approval long enough to build a life that does not need it, which is why I turned to the small, invisible subsidies I had been providing for years in the name of being a team player, the kind that start with a quick favor and end with a monthly charge. So I logged into the cell phone account I have managed since college because my parents were overwhelmed with plans and upgrades. And I saw that my sister's newer line with the expensive device was still tucked under my umbrella because a while back my mother had asked me to front the upgrade and promise to pay me back over time, and time had stretched into a permanent arrangement. So I removed every line that did not belong to the household I chose. I paid off my own device, I transferred the account to my husband's name, and I sent one short message to the family group saying the plan was being closed and that they should expect to set up their own service by the end of the week. Then I muted the thread and let the silence do what lectures never could. I moved through the rest in the same rhythm, unemotional and thorough, removing my parents from a shared safe deposit box at a bank near their house that I had kept for convenience back when convenience still fooled me. Moving documents to a new box in my city with my husband as the only co-holder, and, before anyone imagines scandal, I will say it plainly, I was not hiding money or doing anything that belongs in a courtroom. I was simply making sure that the people who taught me I was optional would no longer have default access to what is essential, and along the way I discovered something that surprised me, which is that the moment you stop defending your right to basic privacy, the people who are used to that access reveal themselves very quickly. Because they call and text and employ relatives as messengers, and threaded through their concern is always the same question. Not "Are you okay?" but "Why are you doing this to us?" I did not skip the wedding, because I had promised myself I would not hand them the neat story where I am the bitter sister who ruined a good day, so I showed up as a guest with my husband, dressed appropriately, on time, and sober. And I kept my face neutral the way you do when you attend a work event for a company you've already given your notice to, and while photographers and coordinators swarmed and my mother glowed in a way that belongs more to a pageant than a parent, I stayed in my lane. And I let the day be what they needed it to be, and the small revenge I allowed myself, if you can even call it that, was a permission slip I wrote for me, which was to leave the moment the last formal speech ended without making a round for approval or a second round for guilt. And when my mother tried to pull me into one last family photo, I smiled and said no thank you, not tonight. And I saw the surprise cross her face because I had always been the daughter who made it easy, and in that tiny refusal I felt a clean break that no toast could glue back together. The next morning, while they were busy posting highlights and counting envelopes, I finalized what would sting more than any picture refusal, and that was the end of a quiet financial pipeline I had allowed to exist for years. A careful spreadsheet I kept that covered the gap months when my parents asked for help with utilities after my father's hours were cut. A spreadsheet that became a habit even after hours were restored, because no one wants to be the kid who lets the lights go out. And This is where the judgment usually floods in from people who believe that filial duty is a bottomless well, but my duty is not to enable a system where I am the dependable one until someone else needs something shinier, so I closed the auto transfers. I sent a final note that said we would help in real emergencies with clear start and end dates, and that anything else would need to be planned without me. And then I did the hardest part. I enforced it by not responding to the first passive-aggressive hint about a bill coming due, and when my father called with that soft, weary voice that has always been my kryptonite, I said I loved him and that he is capable and that I trusted him to handle his life, and then I let the silence land. Before they left for the honeymoon that was gifted by a family friend who has always treated my sister like a project and me like a consultant, I did one more thing that I had been putting off because it felt too final, and that was to send a simple email. Not a manifesto, just a clear statement that I was stepping back from regular contact for an indefinite period, that I wish them health, that I will not be attending routine family gatherings, that any serious emergencies could be relayed through my husband, and that I would not be discussing money again, and then I set an auto-response on the old group threads that said I was unavailable. And I turned off the notifications that had trained me to jump like a volunteer firefighter every time someone else's poor planning became my urgent problem. If you are wondering whether this felt empty or triumphant, the honest answer is neither. It felt level, like a floor had been reinforced under me that had been sloping for years, and the quietest, sharpest victory came a day later when my sister called to ask about her phone service, and I told her, politely and briefly, that the account was closed and she would need to set up her own plan. And she laughed in that brittle way that used to make me cave and said that Mom said I was being dramatic. And I said that I was being final, and I ended the call before she could toss the next hook, and for the first time I did not replay the conversation in my head all afternoon. I just got on with my life. By the time their flight took off, the keys were changed on every door that mattered, and the part one did not tell anyone, not even my husband, because I wanted the choice to be mine alone without committee approval. Was that I had scheduled one last delivery for the week they returned, a delivery that would not be loud, not destructive, but absolutely unmistakable, and when it landed they would finally understand that there was no going back. Because I had not only moved on, I had moved out of the role they built for me, and I was never stepping into it again, which is exactly where the next part of this story begins. While they were on the honeymoon, they had all talked about like it was a reward for surviving the stress of planning a wedding they didn't have to pay for. I used the quiet to finish the parts of my life that still had their fingerprints on them. And I did it the same way I had done every other step, without fanfare, without dramatic speeches, just clean actions that shut doors I never should have left ajar, because once you accept that you have been treated like the dependable backdrop rather than the person in the frame, you stop arguing about feelings and you start auditing access, and access was what I was reclaiming piece by piece until there was nothing left for them to pull. I started with the documents people love to pretend do not matter until there is a crisis. The ones that decide who gets called, who decides, who signs, and who benefits, and I sat with an attorney who did not want a family history or a therapy session. Just names, dates, and decisions, and I gave him all three without the usual instinct to soften anything, so the healthcare proxy that once included my mother as an alternate now listed my husband and a close friend who has never once asked me to shrink to make her life easier. The power of attorney that had been a blank I thought I would fill in later became a solid line with a single name and clear limits. The will that I had never updated after our courthouse day was rewritten with a no-contest clause and specific language that cut off any future claims from parents who had already declared me the daughter who would be fine on her own, and the beneficiary forms that still had a parent as a contingent from a time when I thought default settings meant safety were replaced by a trust that I control and that they can never touch. I went through the small stuff that isn't small, the account recovery emails that still pointed to my father's inbox, because he set up my first bank app on a Sunday afternoon when I was swamped at work. The shared cloud folder where my mother had dumped family documents for convenience that mysteriously became a place to check my travel plans, the spare key they kept for emergencies that had lived on a hook by their back door since my first apartment. And I changed everything without a press release, because it turns out you do not have to defend your right to a boundary, you just have to hold it. So the recovery emails became mine. The cloud folder disappeared and the files moved to a drive I manage. The spare key was replaced by a digital lock with a new code only my husband knows, and every time I hit save I felt one more string snap that I had left in place for years out of habit and a misplaced hope that they would treat access like trust rather than leverage. There was one category I had been avoiding because it would sound petty to outsiders, and it would be easy for my parents to frame as ungrateful, and that was the family items in my house that had been handed to me with a smile and a caveat. Things like my grandmother's recipe cards that my mother loved to borrow before holidays and return with comments about my handwriting, a framed photo of my sister and me as kids that my father insisted stay on the hallway shelf because it makes the house feel like home, and a quilt my great-aunt made that my mother called ours, even though she kept it at my place because it looked better on my couch. And I am not a museum, and my living room is not a curated exhibit for other people's feelings. So I took the recipe cards and had them scanned and preserved. I packed the originals in a flat box with tissue paper that will not yellow. I took the photo out of the hallway and put it in a closet because I do not need a daily reminder of a story they keep rewriting. I folded the quilt gently and stored it, and then I made a list of items that were truly mine by gift, not loan, and items that were theirs by ownership or by insistence, and I sorted accordingly. Because part of moving on is deciding what you refuse to host. All of that would have been enough to make my point without saying a word, but I wanted something that would cut through any attempt to spin, something that could not be softened by a phone call or sweetened by a memory, and that is where the package came in. The one I had scheduled before they left, because I knew that if I waited until they came back I would get sucked into the roundabout where they pretend confusion, and I end up explaining, and explaining is a trap where the person with the boundary ends up apologizing for having it. So I typed a cover letter that was shorter than any I have ever written, 2 paragraphs and a line, and in it I did not perform a case. I just stated facts that any adult would understand, but that my parents have taught themselves to act surprised by, that I was stepping back from the family, that communication would be limited to emergencies relayed through my husband, that I would not discuss money again, that my legal and financial documents had been updated and copies enclosed were for their awareness, that any items they considered theirs were boxed separately and would be returned by courier later that week, and that I wished them health and an uncomplicated life. Behind that letter I placed copies of the documents that mattered and a notarized notice revoking any previous permissions they might try to present to a bank teller or an office receptionist. Because I have learned that the most dangerous thing in a family like mine is the old routine dressed up as urgency, so I included the durable power of attorney with their names absent, the healthcare directives with alternate contacts who are not them, the will summary page with their exclusion explicit, the beneficiary confirmations that showed a trust and not a parent, and a clean list of emergency contacts I want used that did not include their numbers, and I added something that would look petty to anyone who has never been the reliable daughter. A single page titled Closing Statement where I listed, without commentary, the years of transfers, the rent help, the cell phone plan coverage, the airline tickets bought in family emergencies when my sister misplaced her wallet, and the exact month I closed each pipeline with a final line that read there will be no further family accounts in my name, because sometimes clarity is more merciful than hope. On top of the documents I placed a small box, and in that small box I set the spare key they had kept for years, a key tag with our last name on it that my mother bought at a craft fair and called so cute, and a second key from my first apartment that had no use anymore but still lived in their junk drawer, and under the keys I placed a 4x6 print of my courthouse wedding day. Not because I wanted to rub anything in, but because it is the one moment they pretended was a mature choice rather than a corner, and on the back I wrote 4 words in my handwriting that even my mother cannot mistake for anyone else's, paid in full, and I sealed the envelope before I could second-guess the simplicity. I arranged a courier with tracking and insurance because the last thing I needed was a story about how the mail lost our relationship. And then I went for a walk with my phone on Do Not Disturb, and I did not check the tracking every 5 minutes like a person who still needs an outcome, because the outcome was already written, and the point was not whether they read every line or threw the packet in a drawer. The point was that I had finally chosen the form of communication that fits the relationship we actually have, not the one I wish we had, which is transactional and rule-bound and non-negotiable. They landed on a Sunday, and the delivery confirmation hit my email about an hour after their flight touched down, and I pictured the envelope waiting in the mail stack on the kitchen island my mother polishes like it is a mirror that proves our family exists. And I sat at my own table and did not shake, and I did not rehearse speeches, and I did not prepare for a fight, because I had already won the only fight that mattered, the one where I stopped making a case for why my life deserves the same energy as my sister's, and I act like it does, and I knew the calls would start soon, and the messages would escalate, and someone would show up and knock, but before any of that happened, before the noise rose, my phone buzzed with a single text from a number saved as Mom. It said we need to talk now, and I looked at it and felt nothing but a steady kind of relief, because for the first time in my life I did not need to talk. And the next part of this story is exactly what happened when I refused. 2. They started with the classic tactic, the text that pretends urgency is love, and that love means I must respond on their timeline. And when that sank without a ripple, they escalated to calls that stacked on my screen like unpaid parking tickets. Then voicemails with the soft guilt that has worked on me since childhood, the kind that sounds like concern, but is really a request for me to step back into the role they prefer. So when my phone lit up with my father's name, and then my mother's name, and then my sister's name, and then unknown numbers that were obviously relatives drafted as messengers, I watched the parade pass without stepping off the curb, because the point of everything I had done was not to win an argument. It was to stop auditioning for a part one never wanted, and people who are used to your responsiveness treat your silence like a crisis, when really it is just a boundary that finally has teeth. They did the next predictable thing, which was to come to my door, because my parents believe in the power of showing up unannounced the way some people believe in vitamins, and there was a time when their knock could rearrange my day. But that time ended the moment I accepted that surprise visits are less about closeness and more about control. So when the apartment buzzer sounded and the security camera showed my mother looking polished in a way that always means she is ready for a performance, and my father standing behind her with that weary posture that signals his role as the reasonable one, I paused long enough to notice my body's habit of preparing a smile. Then I let the habit pass, and I pressed the button that connects to the lobby speaker, and I said, steady and polite, that I would not be meeting today, that all communication should go through the email address on the letter, that I wished them a safe drive home. And my mother tried to wedge a foot in the conversational door with a line about neighbors and appearances, but I repeated myself once, and then I ended the connection, and that was the moment I realized I was not angry, I was done. The messages shifted tone the next day, as expected, because when soft pressure fails, people reach for the hard stuff. So I got a performative email from my mother about how families work through things and how I was breaking everyone's heart, which is a tidy way to frame a reversal of access as cruelty, and tucked inside was the line that always gives the game away, the one that says, "We would have helped if you had just been patient," and that sentence did not even make me laugh, it just reminded me why the package had to include dates and amounts and closures, because rewriting history is easier when you think you still control the archive, and for once I controlled it, so I forwarded her email to the legal address I had set up through the attorney. I set a filter that moved anything from her to a folder labeled for record, and I got back to the work I had scheduled for that morning without letting her urgency leapfrog my priorities yet again. The part of this that surprised me in a way I did not see coming was my sister's call, because I expected sarcasm and got something worse, which was a bright, careful tone built for optics, where she said she wanted to start fresh as sisters, and that the honeymoon gave her perspective, and she used words like communication and healing as if they were keys she had purchased at the airport gift shop, and I could hear, under the varnish, the fear that my absence might change the way people look at her wedding photos, because everything in our family is ultimately a public relations exercise, so I told her, calmly and without rancor, that a fresh start begins with paying your own bills and managing your own mess. That I am not angry at her for accepting the treatment she was offered, that I am done being the cushion that makes that treatment feel cost-free, and I ended by saying the line that closed the loop I had been circling since the first save the date, which was that I will not discuss the past with people who still benefit from it staying the same. I know there are people who would have wanted me to meet them once for closure, to offer them the generous conversation where I do the emotional labor of explaining my pain in a way that comforts the people who caused it. But closure is a story we tell ourselves to make avoidance look virtuous, and what I needed was not a final scene, it was a final policy, which is why, when my parents drafted a cousin to tell me that Mom is willing to apologize if you'll just have lunch, I wrote back a single sentence that said, I accept the apology you are able to offer without a meeting, and the policy stands, and I left it there, because the most powerful thing about a boundary is that it does not demand a response. It changes your behavior and lets other people adjust or drift. Here is the piece that felt like the finishing move, not because it was flashy, but because it tightly shut the last door that had always been left cracked for their convenience. And that was the decision to formalize my new family tree in the places that train your brain to look for permission, which meant I filed the name change I had put off since the courthouse day because I was trying to honor everyone. I updated every database that still had me as the daughter who can be called to fix things. I set our holiday plans with my in-laws and friends months ahead and shared none of it, and I sent an invitation for a quiet dinner to the handful of people who show up without drama, and during that dinner I made a small toast, not to victory, but to bandwidth, and I said, more to myself than to the table, that being the reliable one does not mean being the available one, and the room hummed with the kind of warmth that does not need a photograph to prove it. A week later, I got one last email from my father that managed to be kind and manipulative in a single paragraph, where he said he respected my choices, but hoped I would come home for the next big family event, and it would have been so easy to soften. To pick a holiday as a compromise, to build myself a little trap made of good intentions, but I have finally learned that the future is written in the defaults you set today, so I replied that I do not attend events hosted by people who do not treat me like a daughter when there is no audience, that I wish him health, that this is not punishment, that this is maintenance. And then I closed the laptop and went for a walk with my husband and talked about nothing important because that is what stability feels like. If you are waiting for the twist where they do something unforgivable and I retaliate with a stunt, you will miss the point that mattered to me, which is that the best revenge is not the explosion, it is the absence of fuel. And by the time they returned from the honeymoon with their glow and their stories and their expectation that I would fold back into the scenery, I had already moved on without them in the only way that lasts, which is to build a life with doors they cannot open and rules they do not get to write, and while there will be people who think I went too far and others who think I did not go far enough, the judgment that used to terrify me now lands like rain on windows I paid for myself, and I do not rush to wipe it away. They will tell their version and I will let them, because silence used to be the place where I hid and now it is the place where I live, and on the rare days when doubt tries to creep back in with its tired lines about family and forgiveness, I sit with the only question that matters, which is whether the woman I am becoming is safer, steadier, and less compromised than the woman I was, and every single time the answer is yes, and that is the thing my parents cannot undo with a phone call or a knock, because I did not just step back, I stepped out, and I am not walking back in.